The day I handed my director a single printed report and watched him laugh in my face was the day I decided to stop explaining myself. He didn't just chuckle. He actually turned to the head of the external consulting firm, sitting beside him, gestured toward me, and said, "This is what happens when you let the juniors sit in on strategy sessions." Then he laughed again, louder, like I wasn't standing right there, like I was furniture that had accidentally learned to speak. I was 26. I had been working in IT security at Meridian Health Systems for 3 years. My name is Priya, and I want to tell you exactly what happened next, because I think you deserve to know that quiet people are not always losing. Meridian is a mid-sized private hospital network based in Auckland. We had 4 facilities across the North Island, around 2,000 staff, and a digital infrastructure that was, to put it kindly, held together with good intentions and outdated contracts. I had joined straight out of university, moved up from junior analyst to security systems coordinator, and spent most of my working hours doing the kind of job that nobody notices until something goes catastrophically wrong. That's the thing about security work. If you're doing it properly, nothing happens. No headlines, no drama, no congratulations. You exist to prevent the story, not to be in it. My direct manager at the time was a man I'll call my operations director. He had been brought in from a consulting background about 18 months before all of this started. He was polished, confident, the kind of person who used words like synergy and stakeholder alignment without any trace of irony. He had the ear of the executive team and a habit of presenting other people's ideas as strategic insights he had developed himself. I noticed this early. I filed it away. I kept working. The situation that would change everything began with a vendor contract renewal. Meridian was in the process of renegotiating with our primary data infrastructure provider, a company that managed cloud storage and backup systems for all 4 of our sites. This contract covered patient records, clinical data, payroll, everything. It was not a small deal. The renewal was worth several $1,000,000 over 5 years, and the executive team had brought in an external consulting firm to manage the process. The consulting firm was led by a man I'll call the lead consultant. He was expensive, well-credentialed, and had apparently worked with several other healthcare networks in Australia. My operations director was visibly dazzled by him. They had lunch together twice in the first week. By the end of the second week, my director had essentially handed the entire vendor evaluation process over to the consulting firm and stepped back into a supervisory role that mostly involved forwarding their emails with a note that said, "Agreed, let's action." I was not invited to the initial strategy sessions. That was the first thing I noticed. This was unusual, not because I expected to be in every room I didn't, but vendor contracts of this scale have significant security implications. Data sovereignty, access controls, encryption standards, breach notification clauses. These were things that fell directly under my area of responsibility. I sent my director a message, asking whether I should prepare a security dependencies briefing for the consulting team. He replied 2 days later, saying the consultants had their own security advisory and my input wouldn't be necessary at this stage. I said, "Understood. Let me know if anything changes." Then I went back to my desk, opened a new document, and started writing anyway. I wasn't doing it to be insubordinous. I genuinely wasn't. I was doing it because I knew this contract. I knew our systems, and I knew the specific vulnerabilities that any infrastructure transition would expose us to. I had been living inside Meridian's digital architecture for 3 years. The consultants had been here for 2 weeks. I wasn't arrogant about it. I just understood that knowledge doesn't stop being relevant because you weren't invited to the meeting. So I began building what I privately called a dependency map. Not a dramatic name, just a working document. It tracked every system that connected to the vendor's infrastructure, every data flow, every third-party integration that would be affected by a transition or a contract renegotiation. I documented where our compliance obligations sat specifically around the Health Information Privacy Code, which governs how patient data must be handled in New Zealand. I noted which clauses in the current contract were protecting us, and which ones were, frankly, not strong enough. I did this work in the early mornings before the office filled up, and during lunch breaks at my desk. I wasn't hiding it. I just wasn't announcing it either. About 6 weeks into the process, I was copied on an email by accident. Someone in procurement had intended to forward a contract summary to my director and had grabbed my name from an autocomplete. The attachment was a redlined version of the proposed new vendor agreement. I almost deleted it without opening it. I'm glad I didn't. What I read concerned me significantly. The new contract contained a clause that effectively allowed the vendor to sub-process our data through a third-party provider based offshore outside New Zealand jurisdiction. There was language about operational flexibility and service continuity partnerships that, stripped of the corporate phrasing, meant our patient records could be stored and processed outside the protections of New Zealand law without explicit notification to Meridian or to the individuals whose data was involved. The breach notification timeline had also been extended from 72 hours to 14 days. In healthcare data security terms, 14 days is not a timeline. It is an apology in advance. I sat with this for a full day. I wanted to make sure I was reading it correctly. I pulled up the Health Information Privacy Code, cross-referenced the Privacy Act, 2020, checked the relevant guidance from the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. I was reading it correctly. I drafted a one-page summary of my concerns. I kept it factual. No alarm language, no dramatic framing. Just, here are the clauses. Here are the compliance obligations they conflict with. Here are the specific risks to the organization and to patients. I sent it to my director with a note that said I had come across the draft contract and wanted to flag a few items before the next negotiation session. He called me into his office the following morning. I had hoped for a conversation. What I got was a performance. He told me that the consultants had already reviewed the contract from a compliance standpoint. He told me that the offshore processing clause was standard industry practice and that the Privacy Commissioner's guidance was interpretive, not prescriptive. He told me that my concern about the notification timeline was noted, but that 14 days was operationally realistic given the vendor's international structure. He said all of this in the tone of a person who has already decided they are right and is simply waiting for the other person to accept it. I asked one question. I said, "Has legal reviewed the offshore processing clause specifically against the Health Information Privacy Code?" He paused, just briefly. Then he said legal had been consulted at a high level and the contract would go through final review before signing. I said I'd like that in writing, just so I know the process. He looked at me for a moment in a way I had not seen before. Not angry exactly, more like recalibrating. Then he said he would follow up and I could go back to my desk. He did not follow up. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in a meeting room for what I had been told was a general team update. I arrived to find my director, the lead consultant, and 2 members of the executive team, including our chief operating officer. I was the only person at the table who had not been given an agenda. I understood within about 90 seconds that this was not a general update. This was the final contract review session, and I had been included as what I can only describe as an audience member. My director presented the consultant's recommendation. The new contract was positioned as a significant upgrade: cost savings, improved service levels, modern infrastructure. The offshore processing capability was mentioned briefly as an operational benefit. The extended notification timeline was not mentioned at all, and then my director said something that I will remember for the rest of my working life. He looked at the COO and said, "Priya did flag some questions about the compliance framing a few weeks back, but we've worked through those." Then he smiled at me across the table, a generous smile, the kind that says, "I am being magnanimous by including you in this sentence." The lead consultant asked, not unkindly, whether I had any remaining concerns. I said yes. I opened my folder, took out the one-page summary I had prepared, and slid it across the table toward the COO. I said, "I'd like to flag 2 specific clauses for legal review before signing. The offshore processing arrangement and the breach notification timeline both create compliance exposure under the Health Information Privacy Code. I have the relevant references here, if it's helpful." The room was quiet for a moment, and then my director laughed. Not a dismissive chuckle. A full laugh. He shook his head slightly, the way you do when a child says something that misses the point, and he said to the lead consultant, "This is what I was telling you about. Every process, every stage." He said it warmly, even fondly, like I was an endearing quirk he had learned to manage. The lead consultant smiled politely. The COO looked at the page I had put in front of her. I watched her eyes move across it. I did not say anything else. I folded my hands on the table and waited. My director wrapped up the session. The COO took my summary page with her when she left. She didn't comment on it directly. She just picked it up, folded it once, and put it in her folder. I noticed that. I filed it away. I went back to my desk and updated my dependency map with everything that had been discussed in the meeting. I noted the date, what was said, and what was not said. I saved it. I kept working. The contract was signed 6 weeks later. I was not consulted during the final negotiations. I received a company-wide email announcement the same as everyone else. For about 2 months, nothing happened. The transition began. The new vendor started migrating data. My director sent a congratulatory email to the executive team, crediting the consulting firm's expertise and his own strategic oversight. I read it. I didn't reply. Then, on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, I received an email from our privacy compliance inbox, an address that monitored correspondence from regulatory bodies. It had been forwarded to me automatically because I was the designated security contact. The email was from the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. It was polite, it was formal, and it was unmistakably serious. A patient had lodged a complaint. They had discovered, through a data subject access request, that their clinical records had been processed by an entity they had never heard of, operating under a jurisdiction they had not been informed of. They had contacted the Commissioner's office. The Commissioner's office was now conducting a preliminary inquiry into Meridian's data handling arrangements under the new vendor contract. I read the email 3 times. Then I printed it. Then I walked to my director's office. He wasn't there. I left a note asking him to contact me urgently regarding a regulatory matter. I went back to my desk and drafted a careful, factual briefing document summarizing the inquiry, the relevant contractual clauses that had given rise to it, and the compliance gap I had originally flagged. I included dates. I included the email I had sent him 7 weeks before the contract was signed. I included a note of the meeting where I had raised the concerns verbally, and his response. I was not building a case against my director. I want to be clear about that. I was doing my job. When a regulatory inquiry arrives, the organization needs to understand exactly what happened and when. I was the person who knew. So I wrote it down. My director called me 40 minutes later. He sounded different on the phone than he did in meetings. Quieter. He asked if I had seen the commissioner's email. I said yes. I had already prepared a briefing for the COO if he wanted to review it first. He said he would come to my desk. He read through the document, standing up. He didn't sit down. I watched him read the section where I had quoted his email, telling me that legal had been consulted at a high level. I watched him read the date of the meeting where he had laughed. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "We should probably loop in legal." I said, "I've already drafted an initial response outline for the commissioner. I'll send it to legal now." He nodded. He left. Over the following 3 weeks, I spent more time in meetings with Meridian's legal team than I had in the previous 3 years combined. I presented my dependency map, my original compliance concerns, the specific clauses I had flagged, and a detailed account of the timeline. Legal found it thorough. One of the senior lawyers used the word meticulous. She said it in a way that made clear she was also saying something else. The remediation process was significant. Meridian had to renegotiate specific clauses with the vendor, implement an interim data processing agreement that brought the offshore arrangements back within compliant parameters, notify the affected patient, and respond formally to the commissioner. It was expensive. It was time-consuming. It was exactly what I had been trying to prevent. The lead consultant's firm was not retained for the remediation. Their engagement concluded quietly at the end of that month. My director left the organization about 6 weeks after the inquiry was resolved. I was not told the details. The official announcement said he was pursuing new opportunities. I heard through the usual channels that he had not been given the choice. He moved back to consultancy work in Wellington. I wished him well, sincerely, in my own private thoughts, and I moved on. The person who was appointed to replace him on an interim basis was the COO herself, while a formal recruitment process ran. On her first day managing our team, she called me in for a meeting. She sat down, put her hands on the desk, and said, "I want to understand what you do and what you need." I told her, "All of it. The dependency map, the compliance monitoring process, the early warning systems I had put in place that nobody had formally acknowledged." I told her what I thought the gaps were and what I thought would fix them. She listened without interrupting. At the end, she said, "Why didn't you escalate the contract concerns beyond your director?" I thought about that for a moment. I said, "Because I had been told my input wasn't necessary, and I suppose I was still trying to trust the process." She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "That changes now." 4 months later, I was appointed as Meridian's first dedicated information security and privacy manager, a role that was created specifically in response to the gaps the inquiry had exposed. It sits at a level that reports directly to the executive team. My work is visible now in ways that it wasn't before. Not because I changed what I was doing, but because the organization finally understood what I had been doing all along. I still keep meticulous records. I still document everything. I still send one-page summaries when I see something that concerns me. The difference is that now, people read them before things go wrong, instead of after. I think about that meeting room sometimes. The laugh, the gentle, condescending smile. The way my director had gestured toward me, like I was an amusing obstacle. And I think about the COO, quietly picking up that single page from the table and folding it into her folder. She hadn't said anything in the moment. She hadn't needed to. Some people announce their intelligence. Others simply use it. I know which kind I want to be. If there is anything I have learned from this experience that I would want to pass on, it is this. Document everything, not as a weapon, but as a record of your own clarity. When you raise a concern and it is dismissed, write it down anyway. Not out of bitterness, but because the truth has a better chance of surviving when it is written than when it is only spoken. Do not confuse being excluded from the room with being irrelevant to the outcome. Sometimes, the most important work happens at a desk that no one is watching. Raising your voice in the moment is one kind of courage. Continuing to do careful, honest work when you are being laughed at is a different kind, and in my experience, it is the kind that lasts. Seniority is not the same as competence. A title tells you where someone sits in a structure. It tells you nothing about whether they have done the reading. Do the reading. Know your subject better than anyone else in the room, and then let that knowledge do the speaking for you. And finally, the people who laugh the loudest at others are usually most afraid of the moment when they will have to be accountable. That moment always comes. You do not need to rush it. You just need to still be standing when it does.